And now, without further ado, and last but not least, I'd like to invite our last speaker for this afternoon session. Uh, Mahmoud has just briefly left the table. Dr. Muhamd Ali is my colleague at the East-West Bridge. We are very comfortably situated in Kuala Lumpur. And I'm very pleased that Dr. Muhamd Ali is able to join us for this afternoon discussion. Mahmoud, all set, the floor is yours. You got to unmute, Mahmoud.
I do apologize. Thank you, Peter, my colleague, friend, and moderator, friend, philosopher, guide, and East-West Bridge for inviting me to this forum, truly illuminating the presentations we have had so far. I am really gobsmacked. Great stuff. Thank you very much. Well, I look at Xizang, many foreigners still call it Tibet, as a case study of US lawfare or gray zone operations against China using ethnic minority leverages. Xizang hit the headlines just last month when President Biden signed the Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act, intervening in China's internal affairs. Biden called on Beijing, quote, to resume direct dialogue without preconditions with the Dalai Lama or his representatives to seek a settlement that resolves differences and leads to a negotiated agreement on Tibet, unquote. Representative Mike McCall, who led the enactment process in Congress, headed a congressional delegation visiting the Dalai Lama in India and pledged, quote, we will not let that happen, unquote, about Beijing selecting the Dalai Lama's successor as though America exercised jurisdiction over Xizang. This was the culmination of a long US covert campaign to influence events in Xizang, while acknowledging Chinese suzerainty, but not sovereignty there. In this campaign, first launched in 1942 by Colonel William Donovan of the OSS, and later refined by the CIA, with support from India's intelligence bureau, thousands of Siang's Champa, Amdoa, and Golok guerrillas fought Chinese troops for nearly 2 decades until Richard Nixon ended US involvement in 1972. The CIA campaign's high point came in early 1959, and I'll explain why this is important. When a large, well-equipped guerrilla force tried to take the Dalai Lama into protective custody, triggering fierce Chinese resistance, the Dalai Lama with his family and CIA armed escort fled to India, promptly receiving asylum there. Chinese forces crushed the guerrillas, and the DCI, Alan Dulles, reported daily to Eisenhower in painful detail of defeat and loss. I'll give some details now from CIA records. 26th March 1959, quote, beginning on March 10 at Lhasa, there had occurred a series of events which led to the flight from Lhasa of the Dalai Lama, whom the Chinese communists were about to kidnap and carry off to Peiping. When the people of Lhasa became aware of this plan, thousands of Tibetans flocked to the city and took the Dalai Lama into protective custody. Disorders followed in Lhasa. A Chinese strongpoint was captured. The Dalai Lama supported the rebel activity. Peiping at first tried a policy of leniency, but subsequently was obliged to take strong measures. The rebels had abandoned Lhasa on March 24th, unquote. 1st April 1959. Dalai Lama, quote, is probably headed toward the large lamasery at Tawang, which is located in Indian-controlled territory in Assam, claimed by both India and Communist China. Nehru wants Dalai Lama in the New Delhi area, where the two can be in close touch, unquote. 29th October 1959. Brother Gyalo Tonga, Dalai Lama's brother, brought Dalai Lama's message to Secretary of State Christian Herter, quote, it was the hope of the Dalai Lama that the US government would continue to help the people of Tibet in the struggle for independence. He was grateful for the assistance from US sources for the Tibetan refugees. The Tibetans needed financial and arms assistance from the US in order to continue their resistance within Tibet against Chinese communist oppression, unquote. Combat waged from Nepal's Mustan enclave ended after the US-trained commander Gyato Wangdu was killed. But now With the Dalai Lama approaching nirvana, his succession question gifted a new tool to America's information war on China. CIA's records of the paramilitary campaign bear insights into US thinking about China generally and Xizang particularly. So here is the document from 26 January 1968. Quote, the CIA Tibetan program, parts of which were initiated in 1956, is based on US government commitments made to the Dalai Lama in 1951 and 1956. The program consists of political action, propaganda, paramilitary and intelligence operations appropriately coordinated with and supported by the government of India. The India bit is redacted from the document. Program objectives are aimed toward lessening the influence and capabilities of the Chinese regime through support among Tibetans and among foreign nations of the concept of an autonomous Tibet under the leadership of the Dalai Lama, toward the creation of a capability for resistance against possible political developments inside Tibet, and the containment of Chinese communist expansion in pursuance of US policy objectives. The Cultural Revolution in China expanded into Tibet, bringing with it tremendous disturbances, including the disruption of internal transportation, communication, travel, and to a significant extent, peace and order. Unfortunately, there are no apparent signs that the Tibetan people are capitalizing upon this internal chaos to seek further autonomy. Chinese security has shown no signs of deterioration, and the control over Tibet, both political and military, remains as pervasive as ever. Tibetan leadership has been purged, leaving the Chinese in direct control of the local administration, and a large number of underground assets have been uncovered and neutralized, unquote. So what happened next? Quote, at present, there are no radio teams remaining inside Tibet. Radio teams continue to function, unquote, south of Tibet. Quote, although much of their information comes from the debriefing of traders and refugees. The next bit is important. Singleton resident agent operations in Tibet, regarded as being the long-range replacement of the black radio teams, have not progressed as planned due to continued tightening of Chinese security in border areas. Intelligence reporting from all sources deals primarily with military, political, and construction activities along the Tibetan border with India, that is. The Tibetan paramilitary unit, a remnant of the 1959 resistance force, is dispersed in 15 camps, unquote, in northern India and Nepal, quote. The Tibetan leadership views this force as the paramilitary arm of the government in exile. Because of the diplomatic sensitivity occasioned by the presence of the Tibetan force in India, it's been enjoined from offensive action which might invite Chinese retaliation. Joint efforts to disperse the force to other uninhabited areas of India have not been successful because of Chinese reaction or of difficulties in resupply, unquote. Joint Indo-US teams, quote, responsible for radio contact with and operational direction of the radio teams, the paramilitary force, and the support mechanism, unquote, in India, quote, continue to serve their intended purpose with a minimum of problems. Bilateral CIA Tibetan intelligence collection operations into Tibet have increased significantly, both in number and value, during the past few years. Activities designed to develop a dynamic political program to weld the refugee communities into a cohesive whole under the leadership of the Dalai Lama and his brother Gyalo Tondop continue. These include the Geneva, New York, and New Delhi Tibet houses, unquote. These Tibet houses coordinated non-combat diplomatic operations, mostly overseas. Quote, the covert training program conducted in the United States, under which some 250 Tibetans were trained, ended in November 1964. 20 selected Tibetan junior officers studied at Cornell University over a 3-year period. This program was concluded in July 1967. CIA is considering a continuation of this program on a limited scale. The Tibetan Organizational Party, the Chokha Sam, in parenthesis, the defense of religion by the three regions, Kham, Amdo, and Uchang, established in India in April 1964 by Gelo Tondap, now has an active press and publications arm. The Tibetans are making an effort to mold it into an effective organization aimed at developing a political consciousness and a political program with which to challenge the communist efforts inside Tibet. Planned programs. During 1967, I'm coming to the end now, the Dalai Lama began what is hoped will be a long-range program on projecting himself and Tibetan affairs on an international basis, unquote, via visits to Japan, Thailand, Ceylon, Burma, Cambodia, and several European countries. Quote, Gelo Tondap, acting for the Tibetan Partnership in our liaison with the Indians, has proposed the establishment of a Tibetan Operations Center to represent Tibetan interests in India. This Tibetan Center would conceivably provide greater efficiency in the Tibetan handling of existing operations and in the relegation of operational tasks to Tibetan assets. Basic covert program to be implemented includes deployment of landline wiretap teams to selected priority targets within Tibet, activation of special refugee debriefing teams, a census of some 70,000 Tibetan refugees spread throughout India and its neighboring countries, which may look at additional operational assets, and the resupply of arms and ammunition to the Mustang Force, unquote. That is the operation Nixon ended for his clandestine opening to China initiative. Washington now seems to have revived the political elements of this used and successful, or pretty successful, template from the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. Thank you for your attention.